Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Into this whole world of brand roasting.
Oh, yeah.
Where we'll be looking at how brands use dark humor, to grab your attention on social media.
Right.
We're going to be dissecting a research paper today.
Okay.
Called, Do You Want to Be Roasted? The Boundaries of Using Dark Humor as a Brand-to-Brand Communication Strategy.
Catchy title.
It is a catchy title, right?
Yeah.
So you've probably seen this, Wendy's throwing shade at McDonald's, these kinds of things.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But does this actually make you like these brands more?
Right.
I mean, is this a good strategy?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing here is that, this isn't just some random trend or anything like that. There's a real science to how we perceive humor.
Okay.
And, it's not as simple as, funny equals good or something like that. Our reactions to humor can be influenced by all sorts of things.
Like what?
Our age, our personality, even our cultural background.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of cultural background, I think before we dive into the research paper itself,
right,
it's fascinating to look at some real-world examples of brand roasting, specifically in India.
Okay.
And the first one that comes to mind is this AIB knockout event that happened back in 2015.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Do you remember that? It featured a bunch of Bollywood stars.
Yep.
And some pretty edgy humor, I'd say.
Yeah, and that event really sparked a firestorm, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
There were legal complaints, government scrutiny, and there was a lot of debate about what's considered acceptable humor.
Really?
And the AIB group, they faced some pretty serious consequences. Their careers actually took a hit.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of an impact that had.
Right.
And it makes you realize that it wasn't an isolated incident, right?
Exactly. And in fact, just this year, we saw a similar situation.
Oh, really?
With the YouTuber BeerBiceps. His India Got Latent episode also landed him in some hot water because of an inappropriate remark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he ended up pulling the episode, issuing apologies, and again, facing government intervention.
Wow, I had no idea that happened.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
So both of these examples, I mean, they really highlight how sensitive this territory can be.
Me too.
Especially when you're dealing with, cultural nuances and potential offense.
For sure. And it's a good reminder that context is everything.
It is, yeah.
What might be seen as playful banter in one culture could be, deeply offensive in another.
Yeah, absolutely. And these cases demonstrate how important it is for brands, especially those operating in diverse markets, to be incredibly mindful of the potential consequences of using humor.
Yeah.
Particularly dark humor.
Especially dark humor.
So we have these real-world cases that show how brand roasting can go very wrong.
Right.
But now let's dig into this research paper and see what it says about how roasting actually works, psychologically speaking.
Okay, sounds good.
And they start by emphasizing that humor is subjective.
Right, and they connect it to our individual differences. For example, if you are, that younger extroverted demographic, you're probably more likely to find brand roasting funny. And to see the brand as cool and authentic for taking that risk.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So someone older and more introverted might have the opposite reaction.
Potentially.
They might see it as aggressive or even insincere.
It's possible.
So it's not just about the joke itself.
Right.
It's about who's telling it.
Yeah.
And who's hearing it.
Exactly. And that's where something like attribution theory comes in.
Okay.
We don't just passively absorb humor.
Okay.
We try to figure out the intention behind it.
Right.
Was this brand, trying to be funny, or were they intentionally malicious?
Yeah.
And that perception, plays a huge role in how we judge the brand.
It's like with that AIB knockout example. Maybe some of the backlash stemmed from people perceiving their intention as mean-spirited.
Right.
Regardless of whether that was their actual intention or not.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting concept, the sincerity paradox.
Oh, tell me about that.
Sometimes the very act of roasting, which could be seen as aggressive, can actually make a brand seem more sincere.
Really?
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, but when you think about it, it makes sense.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain that.
So it's like they're saying, we're so confident in ourselves, we're not afraid to poke fun at others or even ourselves. And that self-awareness can actually come across as genuine and make the audience more receptive to their message.
So it seems like this whole brand roasting thing is a high-risk, high-reward game.
It is, yeah.
If you get it right, you can build a strong brand personality and connect with your audience on a deeper level.
Absolutely.
But if you miss the mark, the consequences can be pretty severe.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk.
It is.
And that's why this research is so important. It gives us a framework for understanding the complexities of humor and how to use it effectively in brand communication. And that's where knowing your audience, becomes absolutely crucial.
It is, yeah.
What works for one group might totally backfire with another,
Right.
The research actually digs into this a bit, highlighting how different age groups perceive this kind of humor.
Yeah, they brought up this idea of schemas.
Schemas, right.
Those mental frameworks we use to make sense of the world.
Exactly. And if your schema, for brand communication is more traditional, polite, professional,
right,
then a roast might seem jarring, off-putting.
Right.
But for younger generations, who are used to more informal online interactions, even edgy, a well-crafted roast can be seen as authentic, and engaging.
So brands really need to think about, who they're talking to.
They do.
And what those audiences find funny.
Oh, sure.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, and this ties back to those Indian examples we talked about, AIB Knockout and BeerBiceps.
Yeah.
They were both targeting younger, internet-savvy audiences.
Right.
But even then, they kind of pushed the boundaries too far.
I did.
And it led to backlash and consequences.
Yeah, it shows how, even within a specific demographic, there are lines you just can't cross.
There are.
Humor can be very powerful.
Yeah.
But it needs to be used responsibly.
Absolutely. And it's not just about demographics either.
Right.
The research also talks about how our personality influences our humor preferences.
I see.
So those who are more extroverted, they tend to enjoy edgier humor, while introverts might prefer something more subtle and relatable.
So brands need to consider both the broad cultural context and the specific personality traits of their target audience.
Absolutely. It's a complex equation.
It is. It is for sure.
Yeah. And the paper goes on to discuss, another fascinating element. The power dynamics between brands and consumers.
Okay.
So traditionally, brands held a position of authority, right?
Yeah.
They dictated messages. They expected consumers to passively receive them.
Right.
But now consumers have a lot more power.
They do, yeah.
They can research brands, share their opinions online,
right,
even hold brands accountable for their actions. So brand roasting can be seen as a way for brands to acknowledge this shift in power dynamics.
Interesting.
By using humor and self-deprecation, they're signaling that they're not taking themselves too seriously and are willing to engage with consumers on a more level playing field.
Like they're saying, we're not these distant corporate entities.
Yeah.
We're human. We make mistakes. We can laugh at ourselves.
Right. And that can be incredibly appealing to consumers.
It can.
Particularly younger generations, who value authenticity and transparency.
Makes sense.
Yeah. They're less likely to trust brands that come across as stuffy and corporate.
It makes you wonder, though, is there a risk that all brands will start roasting each other?
Yeah.
And it will become, I don't know, less effective?
Right.
Like if everyone's doing it, does it lose its impact?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that researchers are still exploring. It's possible that as brand roasting becomes more common, it could lose some of its novelty and impact.
Kind of like how certain slang terms become less cool once everyone starts using them.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it's also possible that brand roasting will continue to evolve.
Right.
With brands finding new and creative ways to use humor to connect with their audiences.
Maybe we'll see even more sophisticated forms of roasting,
Yeah.
With brands using irony, satire, wordplay to create truly memorable campaigns.
It's an exciting space to watch.
It is, for sure.
Yeah, and it reminds us that effective communication, it's about more than just delivering information. It's about creating an emotional connection, building trust, and ultimately making people feel something.
And humor, when used skillfully, can be a powerful tool for achieving all of those things.
It can.
But it requires careful consideration, a deep understanding of your audience, and a willingness to take risks.
And maybe most importantly, a good dose of self-awareness.
So we've explored the dynamics of brand roasting, its potential pitfalls, and the psychology behind why it works.
Right.
But the research paper, it also dives into some fascinating cognitive stuff, like schema theory.
Schema theory, yeah.
Like, what is that all about?
So schema theory is all about those mental frameworks, that we build to understand the world.
Okay.
You can think of them as like shortcuts our brains use to process information quickly,
So how does that relate to humor?
Yeah.
Especially, in the context of brand roasting.
Well, humor, it often arises from the unexpected, right?
Yeah.
When something violates our established schemas, it creates surprise,
Right.
and that can trigger laughter. With brand roasting, we typically don't expect brands to be openly hostile or sarcastic towards each other.
Right.
Right? It's not part of our, typical schema for how brands communicate.
So when Wendy's throws shade at McDonald's,
Yeah,
it breaks that schema,
it does.
creates that sense of surprise
Right.
and incongruity.
Exactly. And that incongruity is what can make it funny.
Okay.
But of course, it's not quite that simple.
Right.
Our individual schemas, they're shaped by our own experiences, our beliefs, and our cultural backgrounds.
So someone who's used to a more formal, polite style of brand communication,
Right.
they might find roasting jarring and offensive,
Yeah, they might.
while someone else might find it hilarious.
Exactly. Our schemas influence how we interpret and react to humor.
It's really interesting.
It is. And what's funny to one person, might be completely off-putting to another.
The research paper also touches on social comparison theory,
Yeah.
which we talked about a little bit before.
we did.
How does that play into brand roasting?
Well, remember, social comparison theory, it suggests that we're constantly sizing ourselves up against others.
Right.
So when a brand roasts another brand, it can create an opportunity for us to align ourselves with the winner, especially if it's a brand we already like.
Yeah.
It reinforces our sense of belonging
Right.
and, maybe even superior.
Like saying, I have good taste
Yeah.
because I prefer this brand, and they just proved how much better they are.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful way to leverage our, social instincts.
So as consumers, we're not just laughing at the joke.
Right.
We're also engaging in these complex mental gymnastics,
Yeah.
comparing ourselves,
Yeah.
reinforcing our preferences.
It's a reminder that, marketing and communication, they're rarely just about the surface message.
Right.
They're often, deeper psychological currents at play.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
As we wrap up this deep dive into brand roasting,
Okay.
what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Okay, well, first, humor is subjective.
Okay.
And it's influenced by a multitude of factors.
Yeah.
Age, personality, cultural background, you name it.
Uh-huh.
What tickles one person might totally turn off another. Second, brand roasting. It can be a powerful tool for building brand personality, connecting with consumers, and even driving sales.
It can.
But it's a high wire act,
It is.
Brands need to be strategic. They need to understand their audience and be prepared to handle potential backlash.
What else?
Third, the psychology behind humor is fascinating.
It is, yeah.
Our schemas, our social comparisons, all these things, they come into play when we process a joke,
Right.
especially in the context of brand and communication.
Okay.
And finally, the rise of brand roasting it reflects a broader shift in the relationship between brands and consumers.
Right.
There's less top-down communication and more of a desire for authenticity and a level playing field.
I think that's a great summary.
Yeah.
And for our listener out there, the next time you see a brand roast online, don't just scroll past it.
Oh.
Take a moment to appreciate the craft, the strategy, and the complex psychology at play.
It's worth thinking about.
It might just change how you see the world of branding and marketing.
It might.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.